We would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. Please join me for a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'm connecting today from North Bay and would like to recognize the land that North Bay is in, the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And the land on which we gather is the Anishinaabe people, and specifically the Nipissing First Nation. I encourage and invite you to recognize whose land that you are joining us from, and let us know in the chat. To find out more about the land on which you reside, please visit native-land.ca.
Good midday, everyone. I'm Rob Boulay, Learning Systems Technologist at Nipissing University, with a focus on support for business, the social work, and the criminal justice programs.
My name is Chris Bird, an LST in the Teaching Hub with a focus on the School of Nursing.
Thanks for joining us for our last live teaching talk of the summer. We have two outstanding guests for our discussion on micro-credentials. You'll learn a bit more about them in a few moments from today's moderators. Through our discussions today, we are going to take a giant step behind the curtain on this hot topic to learn about some implementation successes, hear about some very successful pilots, and we'll learn what the market demand and niche that micro-credentials can fill both from an employer's perspective and a post-secondary institution.
Our conversation today will be moderated by Dr. Pat Maher, Dean of Teaching, and Heather Carroll, Senior Instructional Designer from the Teaching Hub. Now, as part of our discussion, Pat and Heather will fill us in on Nipissing University's plans with micro-credentials and what opportunities might be available to students at Nipissing as a result. So we want to thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to leave your comments or questions in the chat, and be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we hope you enjoyed today's talk.
Without further delay, let's get today started. Welcome, Pat and Heather.
Thanks, Rob and Chris. It's an absolute pleasure to be here on another training talk, especially one with such a hot topic of micro-credentials. For Nipissing University, we're really just getting started in this realm, looking to see what micro-credentials can do for us and how we can sort of integrate that with other extended learning or other continuing studies. So as Rob and Chris have already alluded to, we're at the start of a process here with Nipissing University, which is why we thought it was so important to invite our esteemed panelists to share what's going on elsewhere in Ontario and elsewhere around the globe. So I'm going to pass it over to Heather to do further introductions for our speakers, but thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Pat. And I just wanted to extend a really warm welcome to Emma and Jackie. I'll read their bios before we dive into the content, but thank you both in advance for your time and all your expertise in sharing that with our larger community today. So without further ado, Emma Gooch is a program manager at eCampus Ontario, where she leads the micro-credential file. She has worked at eCampus since 2016 in various roles, most recently working closely with member institutions in the development of micro-credential pilots and building communities of practice. Emma holds a Master of Arts in Canadian Studies from Carleton University. And Jackie Pichette is the Director of Research, Policy and Partnerships at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, where she guides research projects and works with external partners to explore innovation and improvements in higher education. Prior to joining HEQCO, Jackie worked as a consultant at an Indigenous advisory services firm, as a community organizer at Simon Fraser University, and as a government policy analyst. She has an MPP from Simon Fraser University and a BAH from Queen's University. So welcome, Emma and Jackie. I'll direct my first question towards Emma. Jackie, I would like to hear a little bit more about like research and theory regarding micro-credentials. For example, for our listeners, our folks who are joining us today, what are micro-credentials and what do certain groups of people and stakeholders think that they are? And is that different? And if you could elaborate on that, that would be great.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Pat, for having me today. The question that you started off with is not, unfortunately, a simple one to answer. So the question of what micro-credentials are, that's kind of what instigated an entire research project for HEQCO starting just over a year ago. So in the winter of 2020, we noted there was a lot of confusion in the sector about what micro-credentials are, how are they different from traditional post-secondary credentials like a diploma or a degree, what about them makes them useful at this time, why now, who are they serving, and how are they working? So that was the research project that we undertook. We engaged stakeholders from across Canada, prospective students, employers, faculty members at colleges and universities. And we also did a scan of international definitions. So how were folks in other jurisdictions defining micro-credentials? And I'll share my screen in a second to share the definition that we came up with as a result of all that. But first, I'll just note that across all of the definitions that we looked at, there were a lot of differences, but the two kind of cross-cutting themes were that micro-credentials were more focused. So a traditional program would look at an interconnected set of competencies, so knowledge and skills that you'd learn usually over a year or a couple of years or more. Whereas a micro-credential is focused on either just a couple of skills or a subset of skills or knowledge. And because it's focused on that subset or specific couple of skills, that allows micro-credentials to be a lot shorter. So those two things, being short, being focused, were things that we saw cutting across pretty much every definition that we could find in our scan. There were other terms that came into some definitions, things like flexibility, being online, being assessed, accredited, stackable. But we found that these things appeared pretty inconsistently. And then when we did our scan of micro-credentials in Ontario, we also saw that there were a lot of micro-credentials that didn't feature those things. So the definition that we came up with, which I'll share my screen now to show you, is meant to be, is that working? Yeah, perfect. It's meant to be an umbrella definition. So it's meant to be descriptive of all of the innovation in micro-credentials that we're seeing across Ontario and Canada, not prescriptive. And we're hoping that folks across the sector that want to feature some of those things that I mentioned earlier, like assessment, like flexibility, that they can do so. And that would fit within this very broad definition, which is really just to try and get us all on the same page so that we're talking about the same thing. So we're defining micro-credentials as a representation of learning awarded for completion of a short program that is focused on a discrete set of competencies. We also note that they're sometimes related to other credentials. That's kind of a nod to that stackability feature I mentioned, but also to note that some micro-credentials that we looked at served as kind of a bridge so that to prepare students to enter another program, and several others had prerequisites. So you had to complete another program in order to participate in it. So hopefully that touches on your question of how we're defining it. Maybe I'll also just share that, like, the definition that I just shared, like I said, leaves a lot of room for differentiation. And so this typology that I've got up on the screen here is meant to illustrate how much variation that definition leaves room for. So these are just some of the ways in which micro-credentials can vary, all the way from the purpose that they're meant to serve to how and whether they're assessed, whether they offer a degree of flexibility for the learner. These are all different ways that the micro-credential can vary. And this typology and the definition that I just shared are all summarized in a HEQCO report called Making Sense of Micro-Credentials, which you can find on our website.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jackie. And that is a really great segue into my question for Emma and her position, where she sees a lot about the implementation of micro-credentials, especially when we're looking at all these diverse ways that they can, appear within higher education. So Emma, could you share a little bit about what an implementation of a micro-credential may look like, understanding that there's obviously vast variability?
Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to. So a lot of eCampus Ontario's work in this space is centered on 36 micro-credential pilots that we ran from 2019 through to 2021. And these micro-credential pilots used eCampus Ontario's principles and framework for a micro-credential to build out their programs. So they had several key characteristics. They all had an employer partner. They were all focused on specific skills and competencies, and which were relevant to the workforce. And they all had an assessment as well. So there was various implementations of it. We saw a lot of micro-credentials happening as a response to COVID-19. So a lot of them were in healthcare, were in long-term care, those types of projects. And what we found was that the principles and framework was really key to helping them shape the development of these programs. Right now, eCampus Ontario is working with the Diversity Institute Future Skills Center at Ryerson to undertake an evaluation of the principles and framework in relation to how it was run through the pilots at eCampus Ontario. So we have a little bit of a preview of that report already published, and the full report will be released sometime in the fall. And that report is about our focus group with the pilot leads and their employer partners, to talk about the experiences developing a micro-credential using that principles and framework. And we heard that it was very useful in the development, but really what it focuses on is just experimentation. So micro-credentials, we know there's a lot of talk about it. Not a whole lot of people are doing the work yet. So that was really key with our pilots, was just a little bit of funding to explore what it might look like in practice, and to kind of answer some of the questions that we're always asking and see, what it looks like when you're doing the work and what other questions come up, and, the answers that you can come to a consensus on. And, just the ways that just a small experiment with micro-credentials can kind of have ripple effects across an institution. We learned that a lot of the time, micro-credentials would be happening in a little pocket of activity within an institution, and then it would be used as a tool to start these conversations about what an institution policy might look like, and those types of questions that come out of just doing the work and starting somewhere small.
So I'm really interested, Emma, in that concept of starting small, because I think that's where we are at Nipissing University. We don't necessarily have like a wide range of micro-credentials that are already up and running. And I imagine to folks that are joining us, they might have those questions of like, where do I begin? Where do I start? Do you have any advice from your pilot group or, on things that worked, but also things that don't necessarily work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially at a university like Nipissing, those community partnerships that are already existing within your community, within your university, within your community with different employers, small scale, just to have those types of conversations with those employers to say, what kinds of skills and competencies would you like to target in the development of a micro credential? And what is missing in those, whether they're new employees, whether they're graduates, whether they are mid-career professionals who now need to pivot to a different kind of career, what kinds of programming can be created to help bridge those skill gaps? That's a really great place to start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and especially focusing on the local context because, varying contexts are super different. Jackie, I want to put it over to you to talk a little bit about some competencies that you see developed or developing in these micro-credentials from your vantage point, and maybe like how employers perceive these competencies and these credentials.
For sure. So as part of the research that we did, we ran a survey of employers. We spoke to just over 200 employers across Canada. And then we ran a survey of what we called prospective students. So Canadians who were between the ages of 18 and 64, not currently enrolled in a post-secondary program, to ask them about what would interest them in a micro-credential. And we heard actually from Canadians and employers. I think I had, for some reason, expected that micro-credentials might be seen as better suited to developing, say, technical skills. But we heard from both employers and prospective students that they were interested in micro-credentials for both technical skills and transferable skills. So skills like leadership, critical thinking, teamwork, that sort of thing. So that was kind of exciting to see for us, but equally for both. We also saw from Canadians that they were interested in micro-credentials mostly for professional development, but a significant group of them were also interested in micro-credentials for their own personal development, which was, again, pretty interesting. We put kind of the same question to both employers, prospective students, and then to actually institutions, so colleges and universities, listing off a range of features that micro-credentials might offer, and just to get their thoughts on what was most important to them. So I can share my screen again and show you the results from that survey because they were pretty interesting too. So first, I think we'll start at employers. So we asked employers about two different scenarios. First, we asked them to think about micro-credentials in the context of hiring. So if you were seeing a micro-credential on the resume of a job candidate, what would matter to you? Not that surprisingly, we heard that being directly related to the job that's being applied for ranked highest, which is neat because micro-credentials, being so focused, can be directly related to jobs. So that was great. Competency-based, we provided some definitions along with these terms. So competency-based essentially meant that the program was focused on specific skills and knowledge, and that those were assessed. And that ranked pretty highly as well. What was interesting too to note is at the bottom of this list, again, in the context of hiring, being online and being short, employers were not super enthusiastic about those potential features. But when we asked them about micro-credentials in the context of professional development for their existing employees, we see being online and being short actually featuring a bit more highly. Competency-based is still at the top for employers in either situation. And again, that industry alignment piece, so being tied to the job or the industry. Flexibility here was interesting for employers too. So how does that compare to what Canadians are looking for? First and foremost, they want micro-credentials to be affordable, and they want them to be employer recognized. So they care about what employers care about at the same time. Flexible, again, interesting to note, online and short figure in here, same with being competency-based. I was curious, maybe a little bit surprised to see that being local didn't figure super highly for people. And neither did being stackable, which is something that we've talked a lot about, and I think maybe assumed that would matter a lot to prospective students. And then, like I said, we also talked to colleges and universities across the country, gave them a similar question. They're picking up on the industry alignment piece, like Emma said, making those partnerships is really important. Competency-based, bearing a common understanding and definition was important for institutions, which I'll share one more slide to indicate why, again, they're on the nose with that. But again, interesting that at the bottom here, online, so we've got micro-credentials, and it lines up with, we asked institutions about how they're offering micro-credentials. The vast majority said they were already or planning to do so in the near future. And those micro-credentials were, for the most part, hybrid, online and in person, and some of them were entirely in person or entirely online. And then just lastly, that prospective student survey. So it really did highlight that this common definition, this understanding that we're all working to kind of establish is important. At that time, about a quarter of the people that we reached out to, so 2,000 Canadians, had heard the word before, and only about 8% said they understood it well. I'll note that in the US, they've been doing surveys like this, and recognition does seem to be improving over time. So I'd be curious if we did this survey again this year, it's probably changed quite a bit. But at the time, this did seem to be a bit of an issue. But once people were shown a definition, they were excited about micro-credentials, and they were really excited about those features that I listed off on the last slide.
Thanks, Jackie. And taking that from a learner's perspective, Emma, there's been a lot of conversation about ensuring access to a high quality education. Could you speak about how micro-credentials fit into that vision for a more accessible post-secondary experience?
Yeah, absolutely, Heather. And I'll pick up on what Jackie was saying from a student's perspective and from a learner's perspective. The key characteristics of a micro-credential is that affordability piece, that flexibility piece. We know that that's really important to learners. I will talk about an excellent example from one of our pilot projects at Lakehead University. So Lakehead partnered with multiple Indigenous organizations and employers, and they developed a series of micro-credentials that were in mathematics and algebra. And this was actually in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's recommendations to decrease education and employment gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. So in order to advance in a career in mining, a learner or an employee will need a certain level of university math is required to unlock, on the employment ladder, the next rung of jobs available to them. So this micro-credential that Lakehead University developed is actually intended to fulfill these requirements, so that those Indigenous employees can actually access a higher career level by just having that micro-credential. And we think that this is a really excellent example of the ways that education and a full university degree or diploma is not going to be accessible to every Canadian, and by using micro-credentials as just a tool in a system to help to unlock further opportunities, to open doors, to ways of bridging that gap. It's just an excellent use case for micro-credentials, and we think that there's a lot of potential there.
Thanks so much, Emma. And a participant in the chat mentioned about an upcoming UN or UNESCO report about creating a universal definition of micro-credentials that's being released in September. So I think that will definitely inform our work as well. And I would just encourage audience who are attending today, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, to pop those in the chat. In the meantime, I might ask Pat to chat a little bit about where we are at Nipissing University and how these reports from both eCampus and HEQCO have informed our work.
Sure, happy to jump in here. I think at Nipissing University, we're at the early stages. I know that Heather and I have been working diligently behind the scenes, trying to create a sort of framework for university-wide extended learning, or FUEL, as we've called it. That's the best acronym we've come up with yet. But we do recognize that while not specifically termed micro-credentials in the past, there has been a history at Nipissing University of continuing studies, continuing education, and extended learning. And so I think where we're at now is we're just sort of starting the conversation more broadly across the university this fall, to sort of, where do micro-credentials fit with the broader conversation, and where do we want that conversation to go? So we've got some historical record of the last times when we sort of dabbled in this area, and we're really looking to create a framework now that takes that into account, doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but really also recognizes, changing times. We're a lot more, from the information that's already been shared, we're a lot more connected to online, or the industry collaboration, Stackable's interest to some folks, but not everybody. And I think we're also in interesting times here in Ontario in particular. I don't want to throw this out too much, but another piece of the puzzle is recently how the Ontario government has made micro-credentials OSAP eligible, which comes into play in terms of affordability, and that sort of thing. And there's also the currently being adjudicated micro-credentials challenge fund that the provincial government is sort of looking after. So those two facts, the new ability for OSAP to cover micro-credentials and this challenge fund to help universities develop new micro-credentials, I think all of that is going to flesh itself out over the fall. So it's kind of the perfect time for us to be sort of re-engaging with it, not sort of get behind the 8 ball, or not create something that then isn't supported by the masses as they come along.
Thanks, Pat. And we do have one question from an audience member asking, are there certain fields that seem to have more demand for these micro-credentials? For example, arts, professional programs, and maybe I'll pass that to Jackie and then Emma, if that's all right. Just what have you seen? And maybe Emma, you could chat a little bit about what appeared in the pilot.
I don't know that I can speak to demand so much. I mean, we did ask Canadians about their interests, and there was pretty broad interest that we saw, which was kind of interesting. And then we followed those up with interviews of employers and spoke to a range of employers who saw micro-credentials as fitting into their industry in a really helpful way. We spoke to an apprentice who said that the number of someone working in the trades, and he said that the number of apprentices that he's taken on who 2 months in or so decide this isn't the field for me, and they drop off after they've invested so much time and energy in training those individuals. This person thought that a micro-credential could be a great way to kind of provide exposure to a career in the trades, and give people just a taste of this is what this career might look like, and here's what you would be signing up for. So there's one example that had never occurred to me. We also heard from industry groups. So in agriculture, for example, where there's new technology and equipment being introduced constantly, micro-credentials could serve to ensure that employees are operating equipment safely, and that they have the most up-to-date top up to their prior education and experience through a micro-credential. So we heard a lot of really interesting examples in our interview, specifically of where micro-credentials could serve the purpose. But I think what I was most struck by was how broad, in terms of disciplines, micro-credentials could apply. Where I think we saw a more narrow focus was that micro-credentials most of what we heard was that these would best serve people with prior learning and experience. So across a broad range of disciplines, they're really meant as kind of that top-up piece or just an intro, but they're not meant to be teaching a comprehensive skill set. So for that person who maybe decides they want an entirely new career, it might make more sense to return to traditional post-secondary for a college or degree program. But if they're just pivoting slightly or integrating some new technology or aspect of their job, then a micro-credential could really help serve adults, especially in this economy as it's constantly changing, to help people keep pace, but in most disciplines, it seems.
Yeah, and that really dovetails nicely with the term you mentioned earlier about bridging. So it might be a bridge to post-secondary or a bridge to a new career path. It really depends on the learner. Emma, over to you if you'd like to share a little bit about maybe where we're going next and what fields or disciplines you see this in.
Sure. Yeah, as Jackie was saying, it is very broad. We've seen a lot of micro-credential development in emerging fields. So of course, that includes a lot of technology skills, some new and upcoming, to get trained on new technology, that kind of thing seems to be a really good fit for micro-credentials. Another interesting area that I've seen a lot of development is in micro-credentials that target new immigrants to Canada. Seems to be one of the fields that is getting more and more traction with micro-credentials as a use case, specifically so that new immigrants can get some type of Canadian or Ontarian credential on a resume. We find that oftentimes helps unlock a lot of opportunities for job prospects, and that's something that they are really looking for. In terms of where we're going next, a lot of the times when we have conversations about micro-credentials and somebody has been tasked with developing a micro-credential, they always ask, okay, well, is there a how-to guide for micro-credential development? And one of the projects that I'm really excited about that eCampus Ontario is going to be working on next is the development of this how-to guide. So we're going to be using the principles and framework as kind of our foundation for the work and building out a series of resources that will be complementary to it on how to build a micro-credential. It will be entirely contextual, so it's not meant to be prescriptive by any means, because we know that micro-credential programs have unique contexts, and our member institutions are always working within unique contexts. So it's meant to be complementary. It's meant to be just a starting point on how to for example, engage with employers. So sample MOUs, how to divide up tasks with employers, those kinds of resources, as well as things on assessment. So thinking about how to develop authentic assessments that reflect the skills and competencies and show evidence and proof that those competencies have been achieved. So we are actually right now we've put out a survey to the community to help us inform the table of contents for the toolkit. So we'll be sharing that link in the chat, and I encourage you to help us by filling out the survey, letting us know what kinds of resources that you want in that toolkit. And also there's an invitation to join the working group for the development of it as well. So we're hoping to be working with educators and employers directly on the creation of the toolkit later on this year.
Thanks, Emma. That's super exciting. We do have one last question in the chat, and that is, I guess it's an open question to anyone on this call. Does anyone have any good examples of post-secondaries that are recognizing badges and micro-credentials that they have not created themselves, perhaps part of a pathway or a program, and then they say beyond the example of IBM? So I know that's, we're putting you on the spot, but does anyone have any of those examples on the top of their head?
I can't think of an example, but I'll just nod again to one of the recommendations we made after chatting with people in post-secondary about these, was that if institutions can be transparent about micro-credentials and what was required to earn them, so especially when we're talking about digital badges, there's often an opportunity to include metadata as part of that badge. Emma knows a lot more about this than I do. But through that metadata, if institutions could communicate, maybe the level of learning that the micro-credential was geared to, what was required assessment-wise to earn the credential, the content that was covered, that sort of thing, that might make micro-credentials more transferable between institutions and between employers. We know that industry is offering micro-credentials too, as are private career colleges. Like there's a lot of people in this game. And so the more transparent that we can make micro-credentials, I think the more transferable we might see them become.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's an excellent call to action for the sector, to collaborate on micro-credentials, maybe as part of a pathway and a program, and, really centering the learner in that, and understanding that level of transparency and collaboration is really central to from a learner's perspective, and would be useful for a learner. So like Jackie, I'm not aware of anybody who's done that yet, but I think it's a great idea, and one that would be, very well advised for the sector to pursue.
And that's a perfect segue because, prior to the pandemic, we in the Teaching Hub had been thinking through, what is a way that we can not reinvent the wheel, right? And accept people's prior learning as a valuable part of how this all unfolds. And so we'd sort of been thinking through a micro-credential, which we loosely called the triangle model, right? Which was, there's instructional skills workshops out there. There's eCampus Ontario's Ontario Extend program. In the realm of teaching and learning in higher education, we could package existing things together and then take that into our own micro-credential and recognize what's already there and build upon that, versus trying to create a new unique instructional skills workshop or how to use educational technology, which leads me to another question that I just sort of popped into my head. I'm wondering, Jackie and Emma, if either of you have seen any micro-credentials that perhaps are not teaching new skills and knowledge per se, but are more based around prior learning assessment, right? That are for those new immigrants that come to Canada and have a skill set, right? I'm not talking about surgeons or things like that necessarily, but micro-credentials that can recognize, that can almost just do the assessment part to say, this is equivalent in the Canadian context. Have either of you seen those out there?
I haven't seen any in Ontario that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean they don't exist, and Emma might know of some. But I will say the UNESCO panel that came up in the chat earlier, that I'm a member of, that is featuring. So there's a panel of people across the globe working together to try and create a common definition that works across jurisdictions. And that question of prior learning assessment has come up frequently in that panel, and it will feature into the definition that UNESCO will release. So my understanding in conversations with Beverly Oliver at Deakin University, who's leading that panel, is that in Australia, that is kind of a central focus of the micro-credentials being offered there. I think that like the explanation she provided makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of excitement around that. In Ontario, the way that HEQCO at least has been thinking about micro-credentials is that there's some pedagogy that's being taught as part of the credential. So it's a different perspective to wrap our heads around. But if other jurisdictions are embracing it and finding it working, then there's definitely going to be some learning for Ontario there.
Yeah, we've heard that a lot in conversations with employers, especially around, the fact that it came up a lot in conversations around the duration. So how many hours should a micro-credential be? And that factored into, the development of the principles and framework. That was one of the very first conversations that we had, was the number of hours. And if you're familiar with the framework, you know that we have, there's no mention of hours in there. And that was primarily because employers said it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't factor into whether or not they have confidence in whether a learner has achieved that skill or competency. So that's where the assessment piece comes in. The fact that there is some type of summative assessment that demonstrates the achievement of that skill and competency. And so from a learner's perspective, because a micro-credential is short in duration, we have heard that learners will take a micro-credential on a subject that they already have achieved mastery of, just for that demonstrable, verifiable piece with the credential, so that they can have evidence of that on a resume.
Excellent. Thanks for those responses.
And just to circle back, the toolkit that Emma mentioned earlier will be Creative Commons licensed. So all those good things.
Yes, definitely. Always with eCampus Ontario.
Perfect. So I'm seeing not any more questions in the chat. So I will take this opportunity to thank Jackie and Emma again. Your insights have been so valuable for us, and we are very fortunate to have both of you here today to share your experience and your thoughts and all the good things with the Nipissing community, and also anyone in Ontario or Canada or beyond who is joining us on YouTube. So I just wanted to say thanks. For those internal to the Nipissing community, you will find out about these future teaching talks in the same way that you have with the listserv. But for all who are joining us externally, you are welcome to follow us on Twitter at @NU_teaching hub to hear all about our upcoming programming. And we have lots of good stuff. So if you liked today, keep in touch and we will happily welcome you back to other things. So thanks again. Lots of thanks pouring in the chat. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks so much.
And thanks, Heather.